Our speaker for this session is Yuri Prasad. Yuri's a regular contributor to Socialist Worker paper. He's the author of an article in this copy of International Socialist Journalism on the crisis of black leadership in the United Kingdom, along with Esme, as well as also a contributor to Say It Loud, Marxism and the Fight Against Racism. Yuri's going to speak for about 35 minutes, then we're going to have plenty of time for questions, contributions, discussion before I bring Yuri back to sum up in the end. Thanks, Yuri.
Thanks, Kate. So we've witnessed in the last 18 months or so a new wave of struggle against racism, particularly around the question of Black Lives Matter in the US, but over many other injustice cases that have spread protests to Britain and beyond. And I think one of the most exciting things about this new wave of protest is the level of involvement of young working class black people in the struggle. I mean, if you think about the way black people are represented in society, it's the most marginalised and the most unheard voices are now centre stage in one of the biggest political movements in the world. And I think that's something that socialists absolutely celebrate and draw a tremendous heart from. And the new movements that have emerged have revealed a current of black nationalist ideas that we've not really seen on any big scale for quite some time, probably since about 1992 and the police assault on Rodney King and the LA riots that happened subsequently. Actually, I don't think we've seen anything quite like either the movement or the level of ideas that have emerged since then. Now, the ideas that I'm talking about are not a kind of well-structured academic discourse of black nationalism. This is a much rawer thing, and it often sits amongst a range of contradictory and sometimes quite confused ideas that are quite common when a new movement emerges. It emerges fresh, new people drawn into struggle, people perhaps who have never been involved in any particular political activity themselves, drawing on political ideas, welding them together, finding out what works and what doesn't work, seeking an explanation for the world and an explanation for what tactics are required. That's a kind of recipe for a melting pot approach, which I think characterises the period. And it's not something that's just particular to this movement that we've seen. Every new movement that emerges in a similar fashion. But anything that draws new people into politics on a rapid basis goes through a similar process of exploring different ideas, finding out what works, rejecting what doesn't work, and so on. And so, for that reason, I don't think socialists should be at all fazed by the fact that there is a set of ideas that has a very different explanation for racism, where it comes from and whose interests it functions and so on. Just because those ideas are different to the ideas that socialists would hold, I don't think that's something that should worry us or faze us. I think what I would term those nationalist ideas is a kind of common sense black nationalism. And what I mean by that is that I call it common sense in that it seems to reflect the world around you. You know, it reflects the surface of events. And what I mean in specific is that, take for example the idea that all black people have a common interest in fighting racism and all black people have a basis for unity in the fight against racism is a common sense idea. Because we all experience racism, therefore we should all be in the fight together. We have something in common. That's what I would regard as a kind of common sense idea. And flowing from that, the idea that only really black people, because they're people who experience racism, only they can really take a lead in the struggle against racism is another common sense idea which I think which emerges. Now, these are often the initial steps for people coming into politics. Why? Because it seems to reflect the world around you. Like when you look at the system that we live under, with such a tiny minority of people in charge of the system, but virtually all of those people being white, and when you look at the bottom of the system, the people who are most disadvantaged, the most oppressed, the most attacked, and who have the least, the majority of them having brown and black skin, actually, it seems to, those ideas seem to reflect the order of society. So there's no accident why people come to that set of that ideas. And more specifically, You know, when you think about Mark Duggan and how he was slain in Tottenham, you see the white policeman who has the gun, and you see him, it's a white person with a gun who has killed Mark Duggan. You don't see the system. You don't see a system behind the killer. You see an individual, and the individual is a white individual. So it's not, to me, it's not at all difficult to understand why these ideas take hold. And I think it's a sentiment that we can relate to, and I think it's a sentiment that we can work with. I have no problem working alongside people who see the world in that way, but it is something I want to talk and discuss and indeed argue with them about. Now, in addition to that kind of common sense black nationalism which has emerged with the new struggles, I think that there are a layer of people who attempt to relate to that common sense nationalism but weld it to something far more thought out and far more organised as a political force. And those people are people who are wedded to a black nationalist project, i.e. that they want to build an organisation on the basis of those politics. And that, I think, is that's something I think we need to question more deeply. If you think about what they argue, for them, the ideas that best explain racism and racism in a racist society are those of white privilege. And that's to say that all white people earn an unearned advantage by virtue of the colour of the skin, by virtue of the fact that they don't themselves face racism. And the operational conclusion of this white privilege theory is that white people can play, at best, a secondary role in the struggle. You know, that they can never play a leading role because they can never really be free of the fact that they benefit from racism, and so therefore there will always be traces of racism in their outlook. So that's their idea. And the best that white activists can do is to come along to meetings and own up to the fact that they're privileged and encourage other white people to own up and to make sure that no white people seek to play anything beyond a secondary role in the struggle. And that's their kind of their kind of philosophy. Now, that's a kind of more hardline black nationalist position, but both nationalist positions, they're both the common sense and the more hardline position, are first and foremost responses to racism. And no matter how often we have to disagree, and sometimes people will have to disagree quite strongly about these questions, we have to recognise this is a response to racism, and our main enemy is racism itself. And so no matter how entangled these questions can become, always remember the focus, which is the racist state, and racism itself is to blame. Now, what I want to argue is that not only do we have to find ways of working alongside people who have sometimes very different ideas to us, even people who hold quite hardline nationalist ideas, or people we've had to, in the past, work alongside. I want to argue this is not just a pragmatic approach that the SWP has developed to anti-racism in Britain. This is the Marxist approach. This is what the early Marxists, the early Marxists of the 20th century, Lenin, Trotsky and so on, this is what they argued that Marxists should have to do. And I want to make the case that this is the genuine Marxism, and for all those people who've arrived at a different conclusion, I think they've misread the basics. So, what I want to do is to talk now about some of the weaknesses of black nationalism, which are ideas that I think we want to explore with people. We don't do anyone any favours by agreeing to work alongside people but pretending there are no differences between us and them. We don't do anyone any favours by hiding our politics and pretending that we're all in agreement when actually we're not. So here's where I think our disagreements are, and I think we can have them openly and honestly. Now, nationalism is a broad tradition. Black nationalism is a broad political tradition that encompasses everyone from left-wing Labour MPs like Diane Abbott has a degree of nationalism in her politics, right the way through to the Nation of Islam, who are obviously who are a separatist organisation and have a very high degree of nationalism in their outlook. And it includes elements of the revolutionary left who accept some of the central tenets of nationalist ideas. And there's also a separate tradition, a separate but related tradition of Pan-African black nationalism, which is a rich tradition in which, again, I think Marxists have a lot to say about, but in this particular meeting, I'm not going to say a great deal about. But if people want to discuss that in the meeting, then that's absolutely fine. Now, I'm going to talk in quite general terms about black nationalism. Every movement ought to be examined in its specific and concrete form if we are to draw any particular conclusions, but I'm going to paint with quite a broad brush here in the hope that we can flesh out what our approach is. The first thing to say is that black nationalism as a political project has always been weaker in Britain than it is in the United States, and there are several reasons for that. The first and most important reason why black nationalism is weaker in Britain is that the levels of integration between black and white people in Britain are much higher than they are in the United States. So take, for example, this is just one example, look at recent census data. You are approximately 14 times more people who describe themselves as mixed white and African or mixed white and African Caribbean in England than describe themselves as mixed white and African American in the US. 14 times more mixed race people in those categories. So it tells you something about the nature of the society. And from that you can see that the effect of that on the question of housing, the question of unemployment, the question of people's relationships, their family ties, their friendship groups and so on, means that Britain is a very different society to the United States. In America it is legitimate to talk about black ghettos, areas where the whole parts of the city are almost exclusively African American or Puerto Rican or Hispanic and so on. It's not really the case anywhere in Britain where you can say there are anything like those levels of concentration of ethnic groups in any British city. So that's important for us to take on. And the implications of that are that when you think about movements which emerge with a degree of spontaneity, like the way the Black Lives Matter movement emerged in Britain, is it's not really possible to construct a spontaneous movement that involves lots of young people coming together and sitting down in a shopping centre or something on a black-led basis. Why? Because their friends are all Turkish, Armenian, Asian, white, the groups, when you look at any store, the groups are so mixed that it's not really possible to construct a black-led response on that basis. Some form of multiculturalism is going to dominate because that is the dominant tradition in Britain. So that's one reason why Britain and the US are very different. The second reason is that in Britain there is a much stronger tradition of the radical left leading on the question of anti-racism than it is in the States. If you think in Britain the opposition to the EDL, the opposition to Islamophobia, if you think about the fights against police harassment and police murder, indeed, all of them have had the radical left centrally involved, and many of the leading figures of the movement have been people who also describe themselves as part of the radical left. And that means that our politics of black and white unity, black and white unite and fight, have been played far more dominantly in Britain than they are in the United States, where the left radical tradition is much weaker for a number of reasons that we perhaps won't go into. I think it's important, though, despite the fact that nationalist ideas are much weaker, because they reflect a common sense understanding of the world, and because there are organisations that seek to build upon that common sense, that we explore some of the areas of difference. And here I want to outline a few things that I think Marxists ought to be arguing within in the movement. See, the most common argument that nationalists put is that only those people who experience oppression can really truly understand it, and for that reason only those people can play a leading role in the movement. I think that's probably their strongest card, their most played card, and an argument that seems to have a degree of validity to it. And I don't want to start off by saying it's not an argument I want to dismiss, because the way oppression impacts on people has an enormous effect on their lives. Not just their material lives, about how they live, where they live, what kind of jobs they have, but in terms of their political outlook. Oppression, I think, is probably the reason why an enormous number of people who become socialists because of their experience of oppression. They don't like the way the world is, they don't like what the way they are treated, it becomes obvious to them that there's an inequality in society, and as a result of that inequality, they become drawn into a political understanding about the nature of the world. And also, the way it impacts on people personally, the deprivations that you suffer, the times you're beaten up, the times that you've seen your friends attacked, the way the newspapers are, the fact that you find so few representations of yourself that you think are accurate on the TV and so on. This is important stuff. So I want to start by saying that Marx is not dismissive of the idea that oppression really impacts on people's lives and is an important part of how they see themselves and where they see themselves in the struggle. But there is a problem. What do we mean by understand racism? Only black people understand racism. What do we mean by the concept of understand? See, here I think what we're looking at is there's a sense of the black nationalist argument is that because all black people suffer racism, that they must interpret that suffering in the same way. They must understand that it comes, that they must agree that it comes from the same source and then agree on a set of tactics and how to respond to it. Now, I think that's complete nonsense, and I'll tell you why. Think about a number of black figures in political life. You know, you think Sajid Javid is the business secretary of the Conservative government. I have absolutely no doubt that Sajid suffered a lot of racism when he was growing up. But Sajid is now a £150,000 a year minister in a government that's pushing austerity that's hitting black people far harder than any other group in society, and he's quite happy to do it. That's one response to a racist society. Or think of David Lammy, the Labour MP for Tottenham, who is busy working with developers to clear out working class, primarily black working class people out of Tottenham so that he can enrich the borough and say that Tottenham's a better place to live. Now, I'm sorry, both of these people are black. Do I want either of these people being the head of the anti-racist movement in Britain? Quite clearly, it would be a disaster if either of these people were able to place themselves at the head of the movement. Equally, Carol Duggan, Mark Duggan's aunt, who has led a courageous fight for justice for Mark and against all victims of police racism, is white. I have to say, I would much rather her be somewhere near the head of our movement than either of the two people I named before. And I think what it says is, look, it's a little bit like if you break your leg. Lots of people break their legs. But the question about why your leg is broken and what now must be done is a question of medical interpretation. And now, lots of people suffer racism, but the question of where did that racism come from, whose interest is it functioning, and what tactics do we need to use to fight it are political questions. And people draw different political conclusions and different political answers. And to say otherwise is actually to fall into the idea, a stereotypical idea, that all black people feel the same way about questions, which is actually, to be honest, is something we've all been trying to break. It's an idea we've been trying to smash, the idea that all black people actually respond in the same way. So the starting point for the nationalist response is flawed. The starting point is that there's a commonality of interests, which leads to a commonality of outlook, which leads to a commonality of struggle. Unfortunately, that is not the case. If the world was so easy, I think we would have got rid of racism a long, long time ago. Now, one of the key divisions that I think we want to explore is the question of class. And that's not just because we're obsessed with class and Marxists and all the rest of it, but because I think it shines a light into why people respond into different ways to the question of racism, why people think that there are different solutions. Now, if you think about the way that class impacts on the movement, it creates pools of people who have very different interests. You know, but Sajid Javid acts the way he does because he acts as a defender of a particular class interest in society, a group of people who want to maintain the system. But the system itself, you know, Sajid Javid probably hates racism. You know, I don't doubt for a minute he hates racism, but the system is dependent upon racism. And so when it comes to a choice between fighting something that he doesn't like, the prejudice and inequality in society, or defending the system, which depends upon racism for its very existence, there's no choice in his book. He has to defend the system. And again, you can see a similar thing plays out for Obama. Why has Obama not spoken out and taken the police to task in the United States? Why? He said, you know, every time there's a another murder, he comes on TV and it's all, you know, I'm so sad it could have happened to one of my kids and all the rest of it. Does he do anything? No, nothing gets done. Why? Because if you undermine the police in the United States, then you undermine the system of exploitation, the system of property, the system of inequality. He can't do it. He can't do it. Trapped by the system. But more than trapped by the system, a willing acquiescence by his failure to act. And so that class question is crucial. And for us, this points to, you know, another problem with the kind of black-led approach is that it tends to breed a response in which, you know, people who are the most articulate black people find themselves, you know, position themselves in such a way as to say, well, I'm the kind of leader of the community here. You know, that's David Lammy. It's kind of, I went to an Ivy League university, I'm the MP, I should be the spokesperson for black people in this area, regardless of the fact he shares so little in common with the lives of ordinary black people that he's supposed to represent. And where do working class voices, black working class voices, fit in that? The reality is that they're very rarely seen in those. And one of the joys of the Black Lives Matter movement is that suddenly there's this explosion of voices from the ghetto, voices from the street. But very quickly, people who are community leaders and so on seek to appropriate the movement and to situate themselves at the head of that movement, and though the working class voices get pushed to the side. Now, contrast that with our approach. Now, we want as many black working class voices at the centre of the anti-racist movement, in the leadership of the anti-racist movement in this country. Why? Not because we believe that only they understand racism, that only they really experienced it. Why? Because what does it say when you hear a young black working class person speaking at a rally against racism? It says, this is a movement you can join. This is a movement where you will have a place. This is a movement that will take you seriously and that will allow you to become leadership, that you will be able to be on the platform, you will be able to lead the demonstrations, you will be leading the chants, you will have a say in where the demonstration goes and how and where we march and so on. It says we're open to the people, the experiences of the people who are most downtrodden, most oppressed, and most marginalised in society. So for that reason, we contrast our approach of black and white unity, but with black people absolutely at the centre, to those people who talk about black-led movements, but quite often are talking about middle-class black-led movements that are quite contrary to the interests of those who are supposed to be represented. Now, the second problem with the nationalist approach is that when it comes to the question of fighting the state, they have a real problem. You see, if in any sustained battle with the state, like you think about the 2011 riots and you think about what happens afterwards, the whole weight of this ruling class machine comes down on the people who are fighting, doesn't it? All of the media, the courts running 24 hours a day, the police dawn raiding to night raiding, the social workers whipping people up and threatening people with losing their kids and so on, the probation service, every element of the state comes into play against those people who are involved in an uprising. What do you do in response? Now, for the nationalists, they're quite caught, because really the only people who can really fight are those people who experience, but the number of people who are experiencing this is actually quite small as a percentage of society, and the ruling class is quite big as a machine. And actually, when you face that, there's a massive imbalance between the two forces. And the state generally wins. Now, the Marxists have an answer to this. You know, we can say, our first point is that we make solidarity with those people who are writing, regardless of all the other questions, the moral panic that's ripped up, the people whose shops are destroyed and all the rest of it. We make absolutely solidarity, and that marks us out, perhaps from most of the rest of the left, but it certainly marks us out from the liberals and so on. We make no bones about that. But we say something more important there. We don't just go along to cheerlead. We say there is a force in society that can respond to the combined pressures of the ruling class. There is one force in society that can do it, and it's the working class. And we say, look, the working class are black and white, Asian, Turkish, migrant workers, British workers, And they are the people who are facing the state's austerity drive. They're the people whose benefits and income tax credits are being cut. They're the people who are being told they've got a pay freeze for another 4 years. They're people who are struggling to pay their rents and their bills. They have in common with you, who are fighting the state, the same enemy, but combined, they have an awful lot more power. So we can offer the idea of trying to take the anger of the streets, the anger at racism and oppression, into the workplaces, trying to spread it to bus drivers, nurses, to refuse workers, to teachers, to council workers and so on. We try and link the anger that led to the riots to the anger that's in the workplace and say, combined, we are something. Combined, we can hit back at the state. Now, we can do that because we have a multiracial view of society and a multiracial view of class and class power. For the nationalists, that road is closed. The road is closed because you have to step outside of saying that only black people can respond, to start looking to where your allies are, to start looking at who else has got an interest in fighting these people, who else could we persuade to come and march with us. That road is closed, and as a result, there is a tendency towards isolation. And what does isolation do? Well, isolation causes people to think that we have to rethink our strategy. They think because we rioted or we protested and we found ourselves isolated, now we have to think, how do we respond? And it tends to result in one of three strategies. The first strategy is that a number of people within the movement start saying, well, we found ourselves isolated, the police attacked us and so on. The answer is that we need more black people in positions of power. We need more black councillors who could speak out for us. We need some black MPs who would speak out for us. We need some black judges, black police chiefs, and then things will start to get better, because then there'll be some people who share our pain on the inside. The trouble is, once those people get in those positions, they no longer share your pain. They're off. But that's been the tradition, in both Britain and the United States in the last four decades. The second strand of response is a separatist response. It says, because we were beaten, because we were unable to resist the state, because there are no reliable allies, our only chance is to separate from white society to as great a degree as possible and set up on our own. And it's a completely pessimistic response, isn't it? Because it really says we can't win. The only thing we can do is move away. And every attempt to do this has found that the state's not really even prepared to tolerate you moving away. You think about what happened in the US in the 1970s when a number of cultural nationalist groups attempted to build their own kind of communes, really. The state still decided to smash them because they still represented a threat, and they did smash them. Nothing of that movement really exists now. The MOVE organisation, still people are in prison for that now, 30, 40 years later. So that strategy really fails. And if you think about the Nation of Islam, you have a movement which is led by a multi-millionaire claiming to speak on behalf of the poor from his mansion. But really, to what extent does this offer anything to those people who are on the streets now from Ferguson to Baltimore and beyond? And the last strategy is a kind of adventurous strategy. The people who, I don't know about you, but anyone who's ever been involved in a demonstration which turns a bit violent gets a sense of excitement out of it. For a little while, the boot is on the other foot. For maybe a day, maybe a couple of days, the police get the kicking that normally they give us. That maybe something of theirs burns down instead of our neighbours being wrecked. Maybe for a little while it feels as though we have a sense of power, we control the streets, and it lasts for a while, it's intoxicating. And I don't deny its greatness. If you've been involved in a situation like that, you'll know it. It does feel good to have a day when you're not oppressed and you're not there, and we're in charge. To turn that into a strategy it becomes an attempt really to try and seek to capture that excitement, but to try and recreate it, usually on smaller and smaller numbers of dedicated people going around trying to create some form of havoc with the system. But the system really, at best, regards you as an irritant. At best you're a kind of fly, which they send a riot squad in to attack you and they beat you, by and large. It's not a strategy that has ever been able to prove itself to work and to win genuine concessions. Now, I want to kind of move towards a conclusion by talking about the experience of black power in the United States. Now, black power grew out of the civil rights movement, but again, it's a very broad entity that encompasses everyone from cultural nationalists who look towards some form of separation, right the way through to the Black Panther Party for self-defence, which were a Marxist organisation, to which I think myself and many of you will regard as their heroes. What they had in common was a rejection of the previous strategy of the civil rights movement, which was to assimilate into white society, by the idea that really the goal was just to be treated as equal citizens, and that's the end of it. The understanding was that the disadvantage was so structural, that racism was so endemic in the system, that actually we had to smash the system, and that becomes common to many people who are involved. Now, the movement comes into being towards the end of the civil rights movement, and it focuses mostly on the northern ghetto cities, but you can find it in the car plants of Detroit and beyond. You find it in the universities. You find it in music and culture, and it permeates life to such an extent that that millions of black Americans started describing themselves as revolutionaries who identified themselves with the Panthers and other organisations. And from the mid-1960s onwards, black ghettos across the whole of the United States burned. And I don't mean burned for one night. We're talking about major urban uprisings that destroyed millions of pounds worth of property, that required the National Guard to be mobilised to put them down. And it happened every summer from 1965 onwards, every summer. And that Martin Luther King described those uprisings as the language of the unheard. But by the late 1960s, there were definitely people who were listening, and the people who were listening were people who aligned themselves to black power. Now, the movement attempted to confront the state in a variety of ways, but depending on the circumstances. Black Panther Party, you probably know, did all the stuff about patrolling the pigs. The police who were brutalising, raping and attacking black communities suddenly found themselves with a tail on their car with people with guns, bearing their lawful right to bear shotguns and so on. But in Detroit, the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement were black workers at the point of production who sought to withdraw their labour and to hit the bosses in the profits. And they did so very successfully. Their model of organisation spread across car manufacturing right across the United States, and was to become a kind of a vehicle for massive change in the unions and in the industry. But eventually the state is able to quell both types, and all types really, of the Black Power movement, and is able to assert itself and win. I want to just ask why that is. On the first, I'll go through this quite quickly, but firstly, they were able to incorporate a whole layer of people from the Black Power movement. How did they do it? Well, they said it was a similar process to what happens in Britain in the 1980s. They said, if you want real change, we need black people in power. And I'll tell you how you can see the way this works. If any of you watched Kojak in the 1970s, by the time you get to Kojak, the police chief is always black, no matter how many series you go through, and it becomes something that becomes institutionalised in American society. Is that you've got this police, they perform a vicious role in society. How do we head off the problem? Is that we put a black guy in charge. Now that becomes the case with mayors in most of the big black cities. It becomes the prominence of black mayors, black attorneys, black officials at all levels. The expansion of this black middle class is enormous, and it becomes known as a buffer class, a class that will stand between the system and the black poor who are suffering the most, a layer of people who will do the bidding of the system, and that they incorporated a layer of people from black power into the system. Secondly, they sought to buy off a number of the radical kind of do-it-yourself reformist campaigns. So if you think about the Black Panthers' Breakfast for Children campaign, which was an attempt to give every black child in the ghetto a breakfast before they went to school, the state decided to take the programme up. It funded it and said, you want this breakfast, we'll give you some money. We'll give you some money, but once we've given you money, you play by our rules. And people who are desperate for money, who wanted to run these programmes, took the funding, and once they took the funding, they accepted the rules. And the third way is that those people who weren't bought off or didn't become part of the system, they were the militant minority. The state smashed them with the utmost brutality. The utmost brutality. If you think about What happened to Fred Hampton, the leading pamphlet? You know, they burst into his room when he's asleep, they shoot him, and then they concoct a version of events which are so untenable that no one could believe it, and yet still no police officer is ever charged with his murder. And they do it again and again and again, to the point where the nucleus of the pamphlets is so smashed that really it fails to function as an organisation. Bobby Seale, the leading panther, is on trial in Chicago seemingly for years. He's in the courtroom and he's so outspoken that they bound and gagged him in the courtroom, well, so that he couldn't shout and so on. And it became a symbol really for them asserting their power. Now, and on those, with using those three tactics, that explosive movement that had the backing of millions of people in America, both black and white, is defeated. And it's a tragedy, but it's defeated because no significant group of people was able to identify a force in society that could resist the pressures of the state. The force in society that could have resisted was the working class. Now, I admit that in the late 1960s, the white working class did not look like a very attractive prospect to black revolutionaries. You know, to say that there was an awful lot of racism is a massive understatement. But by the mid-1970s, with austerity being driven on the working class as a whole, suddenly the working class in America becomes a much more combative force. The tragedy is, by that time, the flame that was the Panthers, the flame that was Black Power, had been long extinguished. The two things had not met. And that's the tragedy, is that we weren't able to combine those two forces. The force that could defeat the state was never mobilised. And as a result, those people who fought in isolation and were defeated. Now, I just want to conclude with one thing. So a lot of people who call themselves Marxists say that, you know, really the only thing that matters is class struggle and that will resolve the question of racism. I think that's an utterly false reading of Marxism. And I'll give you a sense of why I think that is. But for the leading Marxists of the 20th century, say Trotsky, when he was talking to American supporters of his, who were called the oppositionists, he was describing the situation in America. He said, you know, his scathingness of white racism was such that he said the following. He said, trade union bureaucrats, like the bureaucrats of false communism, live in an atmosphere of aristocratic prejudices of the upper strata of workers. It would be a tragedy if the oppositionists, his supporters, were infected with even the slightest degree with these qualities. We must not only reject and condemn these prejudices, we must burn them out of our consciousness to the last trace. We must find a road to the most deprived, the darkest strata of the proletariat, beginning with the Negro, whom capitalist society has converted into a pariah, and must learn to see us as his revolutionary brothers. And this depends wholly upon our energy and devotion to the work. That was Trotsky saying, we fight for whatever unity we can get. We fight for black and white unity where we can get it, but where we can't get it, we align ourselves with the oppressed every time, and we fight alongside them to the death, and we prove ourselves to be reliable allies to any oppressed person in struggle. And that is the real Marxist tradition, and that's the way I think we will win liberation.
Hello, comrades. Okay. I thank you very much to suggest about two faces. Basically, there's some people in Socialist Workers Party, they go so two faces. But like this morning, I always talk about things happen to me. I don't talk about things happen to people. That's me. This morning I saw some comrades, then I was trying to shake their hand to show the love. Then one of them just ignored me. Then I was quite shocked. Then I was like, oh, we call ourselves comrades. But this is a joke. We're not comrades. Because if you be like in a gang member, when you say you are on my team, that means you're there for life and death together. Then when we call in comrades, it's like about we need to stick together. We need to show love. When we call socialist worker, social, what does it mean? Someone who has no border, who can see no colors. For me, color doesn't make sense. Because when God created these words, he doesn't care people like black or white. He cares just man and woman. But why we start discriminating ourselves because of colors? That's why it caused things happen to Tunisia. We lost so many people, so many British citizens. Why? Because we start hating each other. We need to stop hating each other. We need to be one love in Jesus' name. That's Isaba.
Yeah, I think the way that we can actually get to a united position, like you said at the back there, is I think that real Marxist tradition and the question that raises is relevant right around the world. I'm from Australia, and we had our own kind of chapter of the Black Panthers in Australia, mostly Aboriginal people. And I think the way that was actually carried out, it pushed things massively forward in Australia too. The time when Aboriginal rights took the biggest strides forward in Australia was really that time in the 60s and 70s where workers' rights were always also being pushed forward, because it was militant unions who had been radicalised through the fight for their own, and generally not particularly black unions, but mostly white people in these unions, had been fighting for their own conditions, their own pay rises, fighting the bosses, and then could actually see that point of solidarity and connection with our Aboriginal brothers and sisters, and took the fight to the bosses on a broader scale. There was a whole bunch of instances of solidarity shown by those unions, like, for example, in the Gurindji strike, which was Aboriginal people walking out of from a situation of effective slavery where they were being paid just in food rather than in actual money. This is in the 1960s. Walking off their employment and actually striking for years. And it was the solidarity shown by unionists right around Australia that actually showed, both financial solidarity, people coming up, some of the Aboriginal activists being toured around Australia. That's where the strength lay for them to actually stay out and keep striking for years and years and years. And they ended up winning land rights. It ended up being taken to the point where the Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, was forced to concede land rights for Aboriginal people. That was a huge struggle. And I think that solidarity is the way that that can be won. So I think, it applies right around the world. We have our own Marxism conference in Australia, and we had Kuri Peterson-Smith from the Black Lives Matter campaign come and speak to us this year. And he talked about exactly the same kind of questions are being posed there right now, where you've got a movement on the up, and there are the questions of, will we allow ourselves to be co-opted? Is it enough to have a few more black people in positions of power? Will we allow our most eloquent speakers to be cherry-picked and taken off to the business world or to the world of government? And that's a struggle that they're facing there right now. You can listen to it online if you'd like to. If you look up the Marxism conference in Australia, you can listen to his speech. But they're big challenges. But I think absolutely working class power is the way to take this fight right around the world.
Hello. I'm going to say basically three things. First of all, I think it's brilliant that the SWP have a black members group and a conference for black comrades to do their own thing. And I think it's really important for any oppressed group like LGBT liberation, women's liberation, to have that certain area. But when the reason I'm in the organisation is because when they want help, I'll be there. That's why we're part of a collective. But also, secondly, I think it's not just it's not just the personal effects that affect people. I forgot what I'm going to say, but basically, black liberation, it isn't just about fighting racism as a separate issue for white people. It's also very key to our own emancipation in terms of fighting the system and changing what's going on. So thanks.
I just want to mention about Claudia Jones as well. I mean, if anyone, just on the topic of Claudia Jones, there was a brilliant meeting yesterday about the politics of carnival where Dave Randall talked about her input to really uniting like black and white people together around the idea of like festivals of the oppressed and things like that. It's definitely something that you should check out. But I mean, like when it comes to black nationalism and stuff, I want to sort of reiterate something that Yuri was saying about how, I mean, it starts off by buying into the idea that races essentially exist, that there is something inherent within people from different parts of the world, within people of different colours. That means that they are inherently linked together and then separate from everyone else. And I think this is where the Marxist method differs and is very important in where it differs as well, because if you have that understanding of where racism comes from in society, it can lead you to conclusions which would be unsuccessful. Whereas Marxists come from the standpoint that actually racism was created to justify the emergence of capitalism through the slave trade, to justify the absolute abhorrent conditions and destruction of the lives of so many millions of people. So I mean, this sort of adoption of this idea that races actually exist, it can be quite divisive, but it's also doomed to never quite overthrow capitalism. And I mean, when it comes to the separatist sort of stuff as well, I mean, it's been shown time and time again that you can't live separate from capitalism either. You can't create your own little isolated sort of nice bubbles within capitalism, because they will seek to destroy you in every way possible. And even if they don't, the adverse effects in which capitalism has on things like the environment and things like that means that people can't live separate from capitalism. It's a global system that encompasses the entire world, destroys the entire world, and is constantly expanding into newer and newer areas, which is why it's absolutely necessary to smash it and to smash it together. And just on what Yuri said about the two things not really linking together in the 60s and 70s between the workers' movement and the black liberation movement, I think there's a sort of potential for it in America right now when you see stuff with the Black Lives Matter campaign, but also with the fast food rights and the fact that the black working class is incredibly central to this sort of struggle that's going on at the minute. And I think we have to look towards that sort of stuff in order to sort of inspire what's going on in Britain right now with the anti-austerity movement, and how we can link that into Islamophobia and what's going on with the attacks from Prevent and stuff as well.
Hi, I'm Malcolm K, not Malcolm X, from North London. And I'd like to speak a little bit about a great man who died in the 1880s and fundamentally changed our understanding of ourselves as human beings. You might think it might be Karl Marx, but it's not him. It's somebody else, Charles Darwin. And because of him, we're able to understand that the origins of all humanity, all Chinese, all Indian, all Native American, all Aboriginal, all Europeans, come from one place, and that is Africa. And Africa is the mother and father of all humanity. So any time that any kind of racist or white supremacist person says that there is something that needs to be done that's different, just unroll a £10 note and say, this man scientifically proved, or because of this man, we were able to scientifically prove that all of our origins are from Africa. Therefore, we are all fundamentally Africans.
I was a bit worried which way round you were going to hold that £10 note. I didn't know if we were looking at the Queen or at the back of it for a moment there. Anyway, I'm only joking. No, you didn't, no. But I just saw, as you unrolled it, I just saw the Queen coming over, and I thought, this is not really an emblem of anti-racism. Anyway, that wasn't my point. I wanted to make 2 points, actually. One of them is about, when we talk about our critique and our arguments with black nationalists and the limitations and how the Panthers were smashed and everything, I don't think we should underestimate, however, how important some of the major black nationalist movements have been in transforming people's lives and the political situation. And when, Yuri quite rightly said that the Black Panthers are many of our heroes. Angela Davis is one of my all-time heroes, and I can see the nodding she is of many people here. Actually, the struggles of black people, led by the Black Panthers or the Black Power movement, or even people who we might disagree with even further and further down the line, actually transformed the political situation in America. I think, you can't underestimate that. Not just transform the political debate, but actually transform the lives of black people themselves. And this is something that James Baldwin writes about brilliantly, I think, about how actually the Black Power movement changed what it felt like to be black in America. And he writes letters to Angela Davis explaining this, that, you know, Yuri talked quite rightly about how oppression works, and one of the worst and most disgusting thing about oppression is how it makes you feel bad about yourself and how you start to internalise some of the crap ideas that are thrown at you. And actually people fighting back is how we shake off some of those ideas and people start to hold their heads up high. Now, of course, there are limitations to where that struggle can get you, and that's what we're here to debate. Is we don't just want those moments of holding your head high, we want to smash the whole system and get rid of that oppression altogether and liberate all people who are facing forms of oppression and put down by the capitalist system. And that brings me on to my final point, really, about we talk a lot about workers' power and where power lies to bring down capitalism, and we're absolutely right to look to the struggles of the working class, both black and white, because as somebody said earlier, white people aren't just a passive supporter in this. White people also have an interest in ripping up the system and in breaking things like racism that are used to divide and weaken the working class. But actually, it's not automatic that class struggle eliminates racism. There has to be a fight and an argument within class struggles. And you people will have been seeing some of the slides. Actually, these are some of the slides from Britain and the history of black, particularly of Asian workers, I would say, in Britain, being part of some of the major class struggles in the 70s that actually opened the door to trade unions today taking the anti-racist positions that they do. And quite often when workers, new migrant workers, came to Britain and were part of the struggles in their workplaces and in their factories, they had to take on their trade unions as well as taking on their bosses. There had to be a political fight, and there is a political fight inside the working class as well. So it's not the case that class struggle just automatically deals with this question. There have to be socialists and people arguing about the importance of taking on the question of racism, and there have to be white socialists and black socialists and Asian socialists and all the rest of us taking up the questions of racism as part of a wider class struggle.
My name's Colin, I live in France. There's lots of things I could say, but it would be much too complicated. But just to say that the debate on these questions on the French left and on the British left, I mean, we're just living in different planets. And I actually think that the kind of level of debate here is much, much higher. Not in abstract theoretical terms, but because you can clearly see that it's coming out of a practice, the practice of the British left in fighting racism, in building alliances and so on, with all the mistakes that have been made and so on. So I'll just limit myself to a couple of questions. One is just to clarify the term black nationalism, because it is a term that actually comes out of the experience of Afro-Caribbeans. So do you extend the analysis to... actually, how are you using the term black is kind of my question. Second one is the SWP rightly criticizes identity politics. Now, the criticisms that we have of black nationalism, does this enter into the same kind of framework, if you like? Is this an example of identity politics? Do we have the same kind of criticisms? And my third question, it hasn't come up in the discussion, but it's something that often comes up in France, and I've heard it here, I mean, back in the 60s and 70s when I lived here, the concept of the white left. It's a concept that, as a Marxist, I don't like, and I think that the important thing is obviously where you're at, what you're doing in terms of fighting racism, who you are fighting with, and so on and so on. We often get this term thrown at us in France by a certain group of intellectuals who theorize kind of identity politics and black nationalism. I must say the problem I have is that actually, objectively speaking, in terms of its composition, the left that I belong to in France is white. I mean, the other day I was in a meeting talking about questions of oppression with 120 French lefties, and I looked around me and there was not one single black person in the room. There were actually 3 or 4 people of Arab descent, mainly older generation who have become part of left-wing politics, probably through the union movement. Not a single representative of the young people who were involved in the riots in the suburbs, etc., a few years ago, and not one single person of Afro-Caribbean descent. So actually the term white left in that case is actually strictly objectively true, unfortunately, and it's a real problem.
Thank you, great debate, I will say, but there's a couple of things that I'd like to talk about, and I think we've got to be careful. When we talk about nationalism, any forms of nationalism, you're falling into the hands of the state. Nationalism, you know, are we saying black nationalism, what we want to be ruled and exploited by black people? You know, nationalism, the fact of nationalism itself is about division. You know, the capitalist system is based on opposition and unity. You know, it can afford, the state can afford to have different people, different colours, different identities in a forced communities coming together. Now, any type of nationalism has to be critiqued and has to be fought against. Do you know what I mean? For me, you know, I know we got, you know, you sort of, you know, black people, working people, we've all got to fight for a position within the system. But what we got to be doing, we got to be critiquing the state and the state's idea of nationalism and what the state wants us to buy into. The state wants us to buy into this stuff. We're all in this together. Do you understand? You know, but what we have to look at, we have to look at the situation of where black nationalism is not a fight against exploitation. Black nationalism is not a fight against the state, it's not a fight against the system. It's a fight for identity within a nation. You know, and the problem is, that is where the problem lies. This identity, I'm different. I'm not like you. I'm different. I've got my own community. And that is where the grounds have got to be fought and the battle and the coming together has to be.
Hi, I live out in California and I do African American studies out there, and this is my first time at a Marxist convention for the basic reason that I've sort of looked at both sides, sort of ignoring it, how majority of the states does, like just sort of being ignorant to what's going on, and then getting involved with things and hearing the kind of separatist conversations as well. I agree that the separatist route, like in its conclusion, it doesn't go anywhere, unfortunately. But in terms of like, I agree that only focusing on differences, it's problematic, but kind of looking at racism as just one thing, I mean, particularly being involved with the Black Lives Matter movement, there are obviously differences in people's experiences, and one of the key differences between, you know, racism being a system, being one based on privilege, but also based on power. So I think, I don't know, I mean, I'm just wondering how it works, like understanding that, you know, we can be from the same class, but then also, and so we have that unity, but at the same time seeing the differences. Like, my experience is different because I'm not just based on class, but based on skin color. I have a certain privilege, and it's like a power privilege. So I just wonder how that is answered from the Marxist perspective.
I felt quite emotional when Yuri was talking about the 2011 riots. And let me explain why. I was a lawyer who represented probably about 10 people who were involved in the riots, and a number of things I was reminded of, one of which, and Yuri talked about the exhilaration people felt, that amongst those young people, remember, they were vilified, they were called animals, scum, they needed to be swept off the streets and so on. Not every single one of them, without hesitation, described those days as the best days of their lives. The best days of their lives, because they felt that they had control of the streets. But the other thing that I remember is this, that of those 10, just one of them got acquitted. Every other one was convicted and sent to prison. Now, that might be because I'm a crap lawyer. Fundamentally, however, it's because the state came back ruthlessly, and they've got more guns, you know, more CCTV and so on, and could come back and get revenge. And they did come back and get revenge. And that's why it's so important to say that adventurism as a strategy doesn't ultimately work. The state will come back ruthlessly against you, and they will do so in all sorts of different ways. They will come back through criminalising and attacking people. They'll come back through surveillance and spies and stuff like that. There was the question about, you know, surveillance and so on. Look, they will try and infiltrate organisations all of the time. You know, the truth has come out that over the last 40, 50 years, there was infiltration of environmental campaigns, there was infiltration of the Stephen Lawrence family campaign, infiltration of the Socialist Workers' Party and the Anti-Nazi League. The reason they do this is because they regard us as a threat, yeah. They regarded the Panthers as a threat. And that, you know, the question on nationalism, black nationalism, nationalisms aren't all the same. Black nationalism was regarded as a huge threat to the American system, and that was precisely why they shot Fred Hampton. They sent the spies in. They ruthlessly destroyed that organisation because it was a threat to the system. The question, the tragedy is, and Yuri's right to talk about the Panthers being heroes. They are heroes to so many of us. The tragedy of the Panthers is that when you have 10% of the population identifying that closely with you, when you're selling 100,000 copies of your paper, you have the potential, when actually there's a brilliant article in the current Socialist Review that talks about some of the links that actually were forged between the Panthers and the gay liberation struggle. When you have that potential to build, but instead you rely simply on a small group of dedicated revolutionaries to transform society rather than people collectively as workers, black and white together, seeking to transform society, the state can come back and isolate you and pick you up and destroy you. And that is what happened to the Panthers, why they had a spectacular rise, but an equally spectacular demise. And our argument is that you need collective unity, we need to build that collective unity amongst black and white workers, and that is why, you know, the comrade raised the question of us having a black members group within the SWP. Actually, I think the way that Yuri put it is that we want a black cadre because it makes it easier to win arguments if you have confident black and Asian comrades in every community, in every college, in every workplace, who can argue, encourage, nurture, and so on. But we have that cadre in order to argue about the need for black, and we believe that every white comrade can carry the arguments as well, to talk about the need for black and white unity, and therefore being able to present a united organisation that isn't the white left, but is the black, white, Asian organisation that talks about the collective needs and the collective interests and the collective competitivity and potential of us as workers to struggle and transform society.
Yeah. I just wanted to sort of briefly plug this little book, Marxism and Fighting Against Racism, which came out a year or so ago, because there's this really rich hidden history of there in terms of actually Marxism and its relationship to thinking about questions of racism. And it goes back really to Marx himself, who argued, I think in Capital, that sort of labour in the white skin cannot emancipate itself where in the black it is branded. And he was writing at a time thinking about slavery in the US and the context of the American Civil War, really, and the importance of kind of Marx's own work there. There's a fantastic little book came out. Robin Blackbird sort of edited Marx's kind of writings on the American Civil War and his discussions with sort of Abraham Lincoln and stuff, and why the first international around Marx kind of showed absolute solidarity kind of with the North there as against the kind of the slave-owning South. But that tradition practically goes back to Marx himself and his kind of kind of clear writings against the horrors of racism. And also Lenin's own writings and kind of later on around sort of imperialism and national self-determination and so on. Trotsky, and that tradition carried on meant that after, when you have something like the Russian Revolution, they're able to win a whole kind of layered generation of black radicals, the very best sort of black militants, radicals. Some of them won over to kind of the ideas of communism and so on. So for example, someone like Claude McKay, sort of a Jamaican sort of poet and stuff, gets radicalized in that period of the Russian Revolution, goes to visit Moscow and discussions with Trotsky of the Communist International about how they're going to relate to kind of a black question of black liberation. This is the time when Garveyism is the first sort of powerful form of sort of black nationalism in existence. Very interesting, this kind of history there. But yeah, I just briefly want to recommend the book, and it meant that there was this then, from then onwards in the 20th century, you have this whole inspiring history. People like I mentioned Claudia Jones, people like C.L.R. James, George Padmore. There's a whole rich history of black Marxists have won and kind of developed that tradition, and we stand in that tradition.
Yeah, as a teenager, I was affected by the image of the Olympics with the black parachute from Tommy Smith and John Carlos. Tommy Smith on the podium at the top, John Carlos third with a black glove, doing the black parachute. What I didn't know until I read John Carlos's book is the second guy, who was white New Zealander, actually wanted to do the same, but they only had one pair of gloves. And what a fantastic image that would have been. And they remained friends until the guy died. But that's not what I come up to say. People's Assembly in Bristol, we had a demonstration led by 7 young women students, and the demonstration was 4,000 or more perhaps, that was led off by a black Somali girl of 17, and that was fantastic. And it was a very lively demonstration, brilliant. Last Wednesday we had a follow-up demonstration, and the meeting before that at the People's Assembly, we were arguing about the theme of it, and some people had already decided that the theme should be austerity kills, and they were talking about wearing black armbands and having the Grim Reaper there and having a die-in. Well, what I was arguing, and what we actually sort of carried the day, was that actually it sounds like mourning. I want to fight back, and also you can't talk about austerity killing without talking about racism, because every time a Tory minister or the Prime Minister says something that attacks us with austerity, another one somewhere will pop up, and I've got migrants, or come up and Islamophobia. So if you're going to say austerity kills, you have to say racism kills at the same time. And if you're going to say they kill, that's not good enough, you say you fight austerity and fight racism. Let's go to the banks. Let's not have a die-in. Let's go outside the banks. They're the people who cause this, and let's make this. And that is really a key at the moment. We have to make the anti-racism thing part of our everything we do, because the Tories know that they're out to divide us. They can try and get away with these austerity programs, but the only way they can do it is to divide us one way or another. And racism is the anti-Islamic racism is the way they're doing it, or anti-migrant racism, and it's going to be key for us to always put those two things on our banners, on our sales and our petitions.
Okay, I'm going to respond to just the sort of questions, really, because there isn't much time to discuss some of the other really interesting things that people brought up. First of all, on the question that was raised right at the beginning about infiltration, all I'll say is this, is that they did infiltrate the Stephen Lawrence movement with an attempt to try and find out what the radicals were doing and all the rest of it. Did it stop us? You know, did it? Hell. We put 60,000 people on the streets of Welling. We broke through their barricades. We marched when they told us we couldn't march. We protested in every town and city across the country, and eventually we got the killer in prison. They didn't win. So I think it's a reflection of of their weakness. They want to infiltrate because they don't really know what's going on anywhere. But I don't think we should be too fazed by the question. But what the response that Brian gave, that by being broad and trying to be not a conspiratorial small group, but to be a massive group that operates broadly, is the real key to ensuring that their strategies don't work. Now, secondly, on the question of black and the terminology, I use the term as it was constructed in the 1970s in Britain, as to try and unite all people who suffer racism because of their skin colour or perceived ethnicity. It's a term that doesn't describe even most people's skin colour, if you think about it. It's silly, but it's an attempt to try and unite people who might otherwise be trying to that other people would like to divide on the basis of you're from if you grew up where I did, you grew up on one island in the Caribbean, so you grew up on another island in the Caribbean, therefore you're not the same. Trying to bring people together, say, Asian people, African Caribbean people, African people, people from East Asia and so on have a common experience, and therefore we should resist attempts to divide us along ethnic lines and fight back, and so we use the term in that way. On that basis, the discussion of identity politics, which really emerges in the 1980s, the reason why I think it should be considered quite separately from the Black Power movement is the question of struggle. You see, in the era of Black Power, enormous struggles are taking place, and struggle imposes its own logic. Its logic is, who are your allies? You're going to face the state when you struggle, you're going to face repression, you're going to need people other than yourselves to fight alongside. Hence the Panthers looking for allegiances with the students, looking for allegiances with lesbians and gays, looking for allegiances with white radicals and so on. They're in struggle, they're under attack, they need allies, they are looking for other people who are also facing the same thing, and the struggle brings together a form of unity. Identity politics emerges at the defeat of all of those movements. It's increasingly an attempt to rationalise fragmentation. So it breaks down the term black and says, no, the ethnicity is a central question. And beneath ethnicity, gender is a central question, sexuality is a central question, and so you end up with a movement which was once united, ending in 1,000 pieces. And identity politics ends up that way. Why? Because it is without struggle. It was without the thing that brings people together, and that's why we mount such a harsh critique of it. On that basis, looking at the question of the so-called white left, I think people use that as a slur in Britain and as an attempt to try and make white people feel guilty for participating in the anti-racist struggle. But I don't actually think it reflects the left in Britain. I mean, you look at this event, and I think it's probably one of the more multicultural events that takes place in the city. But equally, if you look at any anti-racist demonstration that we organise, the numbers of different people from different backgrounds who are there. But also, if you think about, many leading figures who are known to be black figures, if you're thinking even of Darcus Howe, Darcus Howe would describe himself as a socialist, and so to say that there is a white left is really a slur that I think is increasingly untenable in Britain. But that's because we fought, and we fought to try and create a space in which black and white people can participate as equals in a struggle. The tragedy of France is that the opposite seems to be true, that the left in France seems to have decided to do its utmost to try and exclude Muslims from its own ranks, and for a country that is such a high percentage of Muslims and where Muslims have been at the forefront of the state's attack, it's an absolute tragedy. And there I think the labelling of the white left, labelling of the French left as the white left is a burden that is brought upon itself, absolutely, and it only has itself to blame for that. Lastly, two other further questions. On the question of nationalism, I think you have to be very clear that there is such a thing as nationalism of the oppressed, which is a response to racism. If there was no racism, there would be no nationalism. And nationalism of the oppressor. And the difference is Nigel Farage and Lee Jasper. Nigel Farage stands for the state, the Queen, the persecution of black people, the removing of migrants, the strengthening of anti-terror laws, the persecution of Muslims and so on. Nigel Farage stands for all the shit in society, and Lee Jasper stands for standing up to the police against police murder and so on. One seeks to undermine the state, one seeks to attack the state for its injustices. However, whatever its weaknesses as a political strategy, it's a response to racism. One wants to propagate racism. There's a world of difference between the two. I know who I'd rather be in a room with. If I was going to be stuck in a lift with anyone, I'd much rather be stuck in a lift with someone who hates racism with such a degree they want to tear the head off the system, but we disagree about the mechanism to which to do it, or be stuck in the lift with that idiot Farage, with his pint and his cigarette, and talking about how foreigners have taken over the country and all the rest of it. I think you only have to think of it on that basis to know there's a world of difference. That's not to say we don't have a critique of nationalism. We do have a critique, but we recognise that we're fighting, when we're having a critique of black nationalism, we're arguing amongst people who share our opposition to racism, and that is fundamental. Two things to conclude. The comment from California describes the difficulty of understanding that working class gives us a commonality, being working class gives us a commonality, but people have different experiences. It's entirely right to recognise that people have different experiences. It's entirely correct to understand that the way racism impacts on black people's lives is a detriment to their lives. It affects them enormously, and it would be stupid to pretend that, you know, black and white, we're all in, you know, lovey-dovey, and we don't have to think about differences. We do have to think about differences. We have to acknowledge differences. It's important, though, that we understand that those differences are there precisely to try and create division. They're trying to sow the seeds of disunity, to make us think that we can't have common interest, and that they function in the interest of the ruling class, which is why I reject the term privilege. Because I reject the term privilege because it makes you, the assumption is that those differences amount to you having a vested interest in maintaining racism and maintaining the system that creates racism. And the Marxist argument is that those differences are there to disguise the common interest that we all have in getting rid of capitalism, and that getting rid of capitalism enriches us all to such an extent that the differences become marginal compared to the potential gains of unity. And so for that reason we reject the term privilege, because it suggests that there's a wall between us that can't really be surmounted because one group has a vested interest in maintaining the system. I don't think that's true. Lastly, I want to finish on the question of glorious defeat. And I want to say this because even those people who have fought enormously bravely and lost, like most of my heroes, unfortunately, you know, Trotsky, Malcolm X, the Panthers, so on, leave a legacy. And they leave a legacy that says that it's possible to resist, that the system doesn't always win, that for periods of time there are openings when we get them on the back foot, that there are times when the system that seems so powerful, so dominant, that we can do nothing to fight it, there are moments in history where we get our chance to overturn things. We don't always win, but the question of people fighting is so vital because it opens up the possibility of victory in the future on the one condition. The condition is that we analyse why we lost and that we learn the lessons for how we can win in the future. So the Panthers are my heroes. All my teenage years, I had Huey P. Newton on my wall. I had Malcolm X with his gun, and so on. They are my heroes, but I must understand the reasons for their defeat if I'm to do anything to honour the sacrifices that they made for the struggle.